It's my bird. Um, so I wanted to talk a little bit about this book. Okay, here's the back. I'm gonna do like a Star Wars, move it up the screen. Okay, so this book, as you probably could glean from the title, is about gender diversity within Native American cultures. And so it turns out that, of course, this is actually pretty well known at this point. If you take like an anthropology course, if you take a psychology course, throughout human history in different societies, it's been recorded, and there's been more integration of people who have diverse gender identities, right? So it's not a new thing from a historic perspective. And this book actually gave me a lot of insight into myself, right? Because as a kid, I had, a very active imagination, but also very open to understanding and perceiving internal experiences. And I would not say visionary experiences because that's not what I believe. It's more like daydream, more like insight, active imagination. But I definitely had experiences similar to things in this book, where it's like you feel that within your own free play of thought that people relate to you, you relate to yourself in a way that other people don't. Because I am transgender. And so for me, reading this book really allowed me to see the historic roots of being transgender, the validity of it, its relation to intersexuality, and the fact that, hey, biology turns out it's more complex than people would like us to believe. So some people say, well, that's a genetic defect or something like that. It's irrelevant. The point is that human biology is far more diverse and fluid than we thought in terms of gender and sexuality and biological sex, right? So understanding these various differences has given me a different perspective. I feel like, people talk about ideology and this, that, the other thing, kind of like a modern dialogue on it. I feel like it misses the point, right? It has historic roots. I mean, even in medieval alchemy, we have the figure of Mercurius, which is like basically a gender fluid or intersexual individual that is sort of the mediator between opposites, right? And you could say, oh, well, that's purely symbolic. It's like, no, it's not just purely symbolic. It's like the fact that a symbol takes upon my bird is he's grumpy because he's supposed to be asleep. But symbolic expressions, it enlists things like gender because, of course, it goes so deep, right? The way that we relate to people is deeply psychological, and the fact that it can change in some cases, some individuals, it can be far more complex than one or two, a simple binary perspective. And that's not an ideology. It's not saying that, I listen to all these different people like Zizek, and they put all these titles, and they kind of talk around the issue. They're like, oh, it's this type of argument, it's that type of argument. It's like, to some extent, it's not just thoughts and thinking. It's emotional, it's behavioral. We can't just dilute something like identity itself simply to thought. Identity is not just thought. It relates to emotions, to behaviors, to perceptions, to intuitions, to a lot of different things, right? And the fact that it is so complex means that if we approach it from one angle, one perspective, of course it's not going to give justice to the actual topic, right? And I just find that when you tie a topic like this to a historic basis, you begin to understand how deep it goes. You know, a lot of Native American people would get intuitions that they were, you know, third gender or what have you. They had different words related to their language. And, you know, language is a way of describing socially an internal phenomena. So does it actually give justice to the internal phenomena? You can't necessarily argue that the construction of a social language constitutes the conceptualization of an individual's sense of self. You can't do that because identity is to an extent social and socially negotiated, but it originates within the individual's experience. So to some extent, you know, the social collective will never perceive the internal experiences of each person to the extent that each person will. And to some extent too, you know, you can't survive for a very long time simply on your own. So, you know, identity can be both and, right? It can be more complex. I feel that a lot of people talk around these issues, do not give justice to these issues. This is one book. This book is not too long, right? It's like 350 pages. This is one book among many books like this on this topic. Many people talk around the issue, like Peterson and stuff like that. They talk entirely around the historic roots of it for someone who's so about the historic roots. One moment. Okay, well, I can't find it. Anyway, Marcia Iliada has the book Shamanism. In that book, even within that book, which, you know, Peterson read, which many people read, it talks about gender diversity, right? And it's in a social context. So it's like, hey, it's not just symbolic. I'm going to check on Bird. He's just jealous because I'm talking to somebody other than him. The point being is that it's pretty well known within the literature. And so to forget all of that, even Jung, you know, Jung has this paragraph within Civilization in Transition. And it basically says that, hey, you know, people of European origin who came over and colonized are going to have to make amends sort of for the damage that they did to the people that they colonized and changed and altered their culture. You know, a lot of people read books very one-sidedly and they cut out the parts that they do not like. You know, it's openness, it's a level of openness. The more close-minded we are, the more that we let fear rule our perceptions, the less that we will see, the less that we will perceive, and the more that we will pathologize in, the more that we will project our own internal fear and insecurity on. And that is entirely what is going on with people like Peterson. It's both and, right? You can never be that one-sided. And to see a problem, of course, it's worthwhile to see a problem. It's worthwhile to try to solve a problem. But in the pursuit of solving a problem, you should never lose that idealistic motive of trying to make things better and not worse. Every life matters, right? You can't say that more is better. Every life matters. It's an equation of equality. And so that's where morality kicks in, right? And we cannot be lazy with the way that we construe our moral systems. You can't be. You have to be very in-depth. It's very complex. But a truly moral system benefits all people. And you can't just say as many people. You got to be idealistic in terms of morality at some point, because you have to formulate principles that motivate continued adaptation to problems. So, all this being said, all this being described, realizing the historic basis of these phenomena, the fact that within these cultures, people are often seen, gender diverse people are often seen as sacred, as spiritual, as wise, as mediators, as insightful. It gives you a lot of insight. Even within, Western culture, you had the cult of Dionysus, and they had something like, I'm going to just use the term, even though it's not necessarily the most accepted, but cross-dressing, because it refers to the fact that, someone who identifies as a man is dressing as a woman, and it's part of the ritualistic practice. So, and then you can debate, of course, potentially there was variations in internal experience of gender. Sure, you can debate that, of course. The point is, unless we take these instances seriously and realize there are exceptions to the general rule without necessarily pathologizing the exceptions, until we can do that, I'm afraid that we are simply making a mass psychology to address the individual, and that will inevitably never do justice to the individual and how complex the individual can be. I believe that differences in human personality and human identity are essential for group psychology, for groups to function. Differences in perspective. People like Peterson say, oh, it doesn't matter because on a fundamental level, everyone's the same, blah, 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 blah. You look at Jung and this and that. No, it's different levels, right? We have different levels of our psychology. Maybe if you go deep enough, we're all similar. We have similar emotions, similar perceptions. The way that we describe these in narrative form differs from culture to culture. The way that we use symbols or create attributions to explain internal experiences differs largely. To ignore differences when we see similarities does us no good. You have to do both. It's both and. You cannot just take a problem and put it onto a different plane simply to avoid addressing topics, problems, issues. You have to see how complex a problem is. And you cannot become one-sided out of fear, out of anger, out of just wanting things to be the way that you want them to be. There's a place for fear, anger, frustration, confusion, but there's also a place for the counter principles, or principles that complement or compensate those dispositions. And I feel like, honestly, when you look at discourses going on, there is so much ignorance, so much fear, and it really prevents constructive conversation. We have to be open to information if we're going to try to formulate theories, perspectives that address actual underlying problems. And to make a problem more simple than it actually is does no service to people. It doesn't help. It doesn't make things better. Although it relieves the tension, the burden on the individual perceiving it, it is an oversimplification of how complex something can be. Just because something is complex and potentially regrettable in your opinion does not mean that the problem does not exist, right? The issue, the points don't exist. And that's not to oversimplify things. Of course, in any form of social role, there is a huge part of morality. How do we integrate people in? How do we ensure that, a role doesn't destroy people? A way of being is not pathological. But when considering these, I honestly believe we have to seriously take into account history, We really do. We have to read books like this. Until we read books like this, until we finish books like this, book after book after book, and realize its relationship to social roles, sociology, anthropology, psychology, until we consume all that literature and digest it thoroughly, deeply, on a very deep academic level. And then we do research until we understand all these things. We are just talking around an unknown that we fear. And that does no one any good. I'm severely disappointed. Extremely disappointed in how modern dialogue goes. People are extremely ignorant of these topics. And they have discourses about them. And it's just fear, projection, conjecture. Sure, there's some factual issues of the present. Of course, we have to take into account the present. You cannot simply ignore issues, concerns, pain, suffering. You can't. But if we want to understand it, we have to take a roots perspective, and then we also have to take a present day perspective. And of course, our analytical methods in the present need to be improved. Our assessment techniques need to be improved. Our dialogue, our discussion of these topics, because they are big topics. Sure, they impact people's lives, definitely. All these need to be improved, of course. No joke. That is why we need a roots perspective. That's why we need more depth psychology, more analytic psychology, but we need to adapt it to the present need. We need to go deeper. We need to analyze, find parallels, find differences, find different ways of measuring things. We need to take it seriously because our research will have very real repercussions. We can no longer shrink from topics, from issues, from points, from counterpoints. We can't. And we can't simply laugh off arguments. We can't simply ignore or reduce things to one-sided rebuttals like, oh, I'm just going to philosophically do away with your arguments or your points, or I'm just going to use my emotions to do away with them, or I'm going to take, a small bit of research to do away with it. No, we need comprehensive analysis. We need to address it from multiple perspectives. That is the only way that we can ever address things as complex as human identity and personality psychology. We cannot use just one perspective. And it has to be, over time, cross groups, cross cultures, cross methods, cross perspectives. Have to do those things. And until we do, we're just dancing around the problem. And that's as much as a criticism as anyone else has of myself. Me personally, I am beginning to consume more and more literature. I'm beginning to consume literature on different therapeutic approaches, internal family systems. I'm reading Pierre Janet. I'm reading the depth psychologists. I'm reading modern day neuroscience. I'm reading anthropological books. I'm reading, books on shamanism, books on diverse, religious experiences. I'm reading even, standard popular media. I'm trying to get a comprehensive picture of it. That's the only way that we gain enough insight, enough understanding to actually address these problems. Lazy thinking, lazy research, lazy analysis will get us absolutely nowhere. And I'm tired of it.